Are you into long, strappy houseplants? If so, stick around with me and I'll give you a review for a truly stunning philodendron. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me. It's tropical houseplants. So today is going to be a continuation of the plant review series. I know I'm kind of like interspersing these videos recently, so I'm quite enjoying doing some reviews again. And today I wanted to do a review for a plant that I don't think I've done a review before. I mean, look at that leaf. Oh. This, for the people that might not know, is the Philodendron Patricia. I'm not entirely sure how you'd pronounce it, but this I have now had for long enough in my collection that I can actually do a bit of a review. So without further ado, let's dive into it. I was going to put the plant down, but we know that I'm going to end up holding it for most of the video and give myself a sore arm. But yes, Philodendron Patriciae. I'll bring it in so you can kind of see that's the newest leaf, which is absolutely ginormous. Some of the older leaves, the oldest leaves are here. This one's obviously on the way out. And there is a new leaf that is coming in. Now you might be able to see that the tip is gone. What happened is that this plant was right next to the roof of my conservatory basically, and it just got super hot. Didn't realize, and the tip essentially had burnt off. It was kind of black and burning off, but because it was so dried and so burnt off, it was kind of stuck together. So I'm just like, you know what, let's just snip the tip off, and it will be a leaf that will probably be missing, I would assume, about this much of the leaf, but it should hopefully still be long enough that it will be impressive. I have since moved it around so that it's not going to have this issue. But looking at the background of this plant, now, I'll kind of talk a bit more about how it came into my awareness. I think it was a good few years back, probably 3 years back, and I was watching Legends of Monstera that's on here, which unfortunately I think Legends of Monstera doesn't really post any videos anymore, but there is a great deal of old videos on his channel. By all means, please go and check it out. And one of the things that he was doing is he was going to kind of long-term collectors of aroids, of tropical houseplants, and having a chat with them and talking about their collections. And this was a plant that I saw, I was aware of it, but I saw for the first time in one of the videos that he did with a collector. And it was absolutely huge. It was on a moss pole, and it was very long and large and in charge. And actually that video alone kind of like was niggling in the back of my head, because I knew, and a lot of people would say, the Philodendron Patriciae is a particularly fussy plant. I wouldn't disagree, but more on that in just a bit. But it gives Philodendron esmeraldense vibes, but without the wide leaves. I mean, that is the Anthurium esmeraldense there. But yeah, it's the same kind of notion, because you'll get all of that lovely ruffling. It's a slightly different kind of ruffle that you will get with the Philodendron esmeraldense, but nonetheless, and you do get those kind of long, thinner leaves that are happening there. However, as I said, there was a bit of a rumor for this, that this was almost, I think for some people, this would almost be considered the philodendron version of the Queen Anthurium in terms of how fussy it can be. Maybe not to the same level, because I don't think anything will ever touch that for the Queen Anthurium, but very similar, but for a philodendron. So I was a bit hesitant, knowing that, to ever potentially add this into my collection. However, that video that I was just talking about with Legends of Monstera, when they were talking to that kind of collector, they were saying that, you know what, it's fine, as long as you can deal with the plant throwing a hissy fit for the first 6 months to a year when it comes into your collection, until it kind of acclimates to your space. It takes a long time to acclimate, and it's not the fastest, but I'll get to that in just a minute. then you should be fine. And for anybody that has been around for long enough, when I was mentioning my Begonia amphioxus, that's another one that technically needs a terrarium or kind of a glass cabinet, but actually you can grow it out in the house. It's just going to look a bit busted for 6 months to a year, and then it will acclimate, and then you're fine. You can kind of grow it in whatever condition, and I can vouch for that because it hasn't just grown in my conservatory, it has also grown in household conditions without any problem. But yes, so that's kind of what gave me the courage to just kind of go, you know what, if I find it and it's a decent price, it was still super expensive back then, I'll pick it up, basically. Long story short, about a year ago, probably just over a year ago, I think this was probably one of my first Ecuagenera unboxings, and I'll kind of link the video at the top when I was unboxing this. I'm just like, you know what, it's a decent price, I'll pick it up. Why not? Let's give this a try. And that's how this came into my collection. Now, coming into speed of growth with this one, and I did kind of like briefly touch on this just a moment ago, this is not a super fast philodendron, at least not in my experience. I will caveat this, and I'll dive into it a bit more into accessories and care. I am growing this in semi-hydro, so I'm growing this in Soil Ninja's coarse semi-hydro mix, purely because I knew that this was going to be fussy. I knew that it needed a decent level of water, but it could also go towards root rot really simply. So I'm just like, you know what? I'm not going to risk it. Let's just put this into semi-hydro, and it will take a bit longer. Same experience I've had with all of my philodendrons when I put them in semi-hydro, but I was okay with that. And to be fair to this plant, yes, it has been a bit slow, but actually, considering how much it has sized up in terms of its leaves, since being in semi-hydro, I would say that this one does well in semi-hydro, because a lot of the times, again, for the people that have been here for a while, will know that part of the reason why I put some of my plants in semi-hydro is because I want them to slow down a bit and not grow super quickly and super large, because I just don't have the space in here. But this one didn't take a beat at all. But and I'll put it into context in terms of when I say a bit slow in terms of growth. If golden pothos in this space in the growing season will grow 2 to 3 leaves each month, this might grow 1 leaf. In the winter, I find that this plant almost entirely stops. In the winter months, and I will say this kind of from October, November time, because I live in the UK, so the winter's a bit longer, or at least what I would class from a warm country as a winter. So from October, November time until pretty much March, I might get 1 leaf. In the growing season, I might get a leaf every month and a half. So it really isn't that quick of a plant. And again, caveat to that being is it is in semi-hydro. So you might have it in a soil mix, and if you do and you're growing yours in a soil mix, please let us all know down below your experience. And yeah, so it's just a bit slower. Also, there is one very specific individual, hopefully you know who I'm talking about, because I also did a video with them about their collection, and they were doing an unboxing as well, who has got a very large Patriciae back then. I think the Patriciae that they had is probably this size back then, maybe a bit bigger. I'm assuming it's even bigger still. So if you see this video and you want to comment a bit down below about how your experience has been with this plant, that would be greatly appreciated. I won't name names, but hopefully that. Most people probably clocked it at this point. But yes, that's my 2 cents on speed of growth for this plant. Now, ease of propagation on this plant specifically, and again, I'll be transparent, I haven't chopped and propped this yet. And again, I know a few people that have grown this plant, they have done that. So I would look to you to let us all know down below what your experiences have been. However, I will say this didn't have an awful lot of roots, so I kind of treated it a bit like a propagate. And as I said, it went straight into a semi-hydro mix, and it did okay. It did okay. It took a while to get going. I would imagine this, being as slow as it is, wouldn't be the fastest thing to propagate either. I wouldn't know in terms of a media if I were to consider propagating it directly into something like semi-hydro. It didn't have a lot of roots for this one, but it did have some. So that is the slight caveat there. But the one thing I will say, since giving this a moss pole, and hopefully you might be able to see the root that is coming up there, and it's also coming up here, this will quite happily throw out aerial roots, and as long as you give it a moss pole, and I only gave this a moss pole probably about a couple of months ago, and this largest leaf happened pretty much almost instantaneously after I gave it a moss pole. So I would suggest that this needs a moss pole. It did okay without a moss pole. It did, I mean, this leaf here, it didn't have a moss pole and it was relatively large. It will just take a bit longer to size up. Do I think it needs a moss pole? Probably not. But the point I was trying to make wasn't about moss poles, was the fact that because it will root out this easily, I would maybe suggest with this plant, as I would say generally for most plants, that's probably going to be your safest bet. Something like air layering, where you take a bunch of like damp sphagnum moss, you put it around a node with an aerial root preferably already on it, maybe not a crispy aerial root, and kind of make sure that it's damp but it's not sapping wet. Wrap something like cling film or something like that to keep the moisture in on the actual node. You should be fine. This should root out relatively quickly, and then you've basically got a started plant because you're not cutting anything yet, you're not waiting for it to do anything. It's a much better way generally, I find, to propagate most plants. If I had the time to go around as often as I do to spray down and re-moisten the, the air layering kind of balls of moss, then I would do that for most of my plants, but I ain't got no time for that. So only very special plants get it. But yes, that would be my kind of 2 cents on easy propagation with this one. Now availability, and I did touch on this. Availability on this one it's not the most available plant that you'll find generally, even to this day, and I think part of that is because it has got that reputation of being a bit harder to grow. As I said, it's not undeserved, but it probably has that reputation. It still stayed relatively expensive for a long period of time. It has come down to double digits, mid double digits, I'd say now, maybe a bit lower. I did get mine, as I mentioned, from Ecuador, so it wasn't that expensive. If I do find what the price was, and actually I think I know what the price was on this. I think this was close to like $30 or $40 because it was on the higher end of their plants when I bought it back then. I think it has since gone down in price on their website, but on average, if you're buying it locally, like I've said for most of my review videos, you're likely to find this a bit more expensive because you're essentially paying for the fact that you can buy it locally. A plant shop maybe bought it in, imported it from another country. They've since grown it on a bit, and then they are then selling it on to you. So you are paying for that. But there's a few more available, but not a huge deal. Do I ever think this is going to become a super cheap plant and super readily available? Probably not. I think if this had as much hype as the Queen Anthurium, then possibly, but it doesn't. And there are strappy leaf philodendrons that are easier. Point in case, it's got a similar vibe. It's a bit wider. I know you can get a philodendron as a middle dense narrow form. So it would tick a lot of those boxes without having to deal with the slightly more precious element that is this plant and kind of being a bit more, I don't know if I'm happy. Yes, I'm happy. No, I'm not happy. Blah, blah, blah. So that's why, in my humble opinion, I don't think this is going to become super readily available or super cheap. Because again, it's not for everybody, and it is a plant that, yes, it doesn't grow massively wide. I don't think it's ever going to get much wider than what you're seeing in front of you now, but it does hang, which is good because it means it can be a bit more columnar. But it is a very specific plant that only specific people would probably want. It's not, yeah, I don't think it would tick an awful lot of boxes for absolutely everybody to have a good appeal, but I mean, I like it, so it works for me. But now coming into pests for this one, I'm gonna see if I can, yeah, I can. Can you see, hopefully that will focus on the leaf. Can you see the slightly yellowy bits at the back there? That was thrip damage on this. This had thrips at some point. I did not realise. And the other thing that you might be able to see there, if I don't know whether or not that's going to focus enough for you to see. Can you see some of the lighter areas at the back of that leaf there? This is also one of the few philodendrons that I own that tends to get edema a bit more, so it's the bursting of the cells because the water gets absorbed too quickly. It might be because of the way that I'm growing it, so if it is, please ignore. But also, actually, maybe don't ignore it, because if you're going to grow it in semi-hydro, you need to be aware of this. This is a plant that I have seen most pests on, so thrips, definitely. However, I will caveat this quite quickly and say you wouldn't tell in terms of damage, and I've only ever seen any form of thrip damage on this plant on the backs of the leaves, not the front of the leaves. So actually, if you're seeing the front of the leaves for the majority of the time, you might not see the thrips damage. So check the back of the leaves with this 100% of the time. Maybe one else, did I have spider mites? I think I had spider mites on this at some point, but again, you wouldn't be able to tell from any of these leaves. Did I have spider mites? I'm trying to think actually, maybe I didn't. No, I didn't actually. I didn't have spider mites, had thrips, and the occasional mealybug, but the mealybugs don't gravitate towards this at all, and it has been around other plants that had mealybugs for a very long period of time and nothing went onto this. So good thing to be aware of, but thrips is one of the things that they do enjoy munching on. So into care and accessories for this one. So I mentioned it already, moss pole. I would say a moss pole is almost a must on this plant. Would I don't even know if it is technically an obligate climber. I would say no, because for a long period of time I was just growing it on a janky support stick and it was fine. It was still sizing up. It just grew a bit slower and sized up a bit less between each leaf size. So you can see that one there and then that one there. There is a significant size difference. Maybe not that much of a size difference, but there was a size difference, and it has been a lot faster in terms of growing new leaves since putting it on a moss pole. So my suggestion would be, if you can, give it a moss pole, but if you can't, it should still be okay with just a janky support stick. It was fine for me. In terms of growing this in semi-hydro, 100% approved. Do I think this would also do well in a soil mix? Yes. I've done another video in terms of my little weird tips where I think that if you're going to get this and you can give it something that you would use for an anthurium, so very, very airy and chunky in terms of a soil mix, that would probably be my suggestion for this in terms of growing it in soil. That will do really well, and it also gives you a tiny peace of mind with this plant. The other thing I will say with this, I have let it has dried up quite a bit, because this didn't really have a water reservoir until the last week, where we've just had a bit of a heat wave-ish in the UK, and it was fine drying out considerably, and you weren't even getting much stress on the leaves. So actually, in terms of care, I would say wait until this is dry, as dry as you can get it. It doesn't need to be a cactus in terms of how dry the soil is going to be, and then water it thoroughly, flush it all the way through, and kind of keep doing that, and you should be okay. Is this a particularly heavy feeder? Probably not, I would say, but it gets fertilized the same as I do with most of my other plants, so weekly, or weekly every time it's watered. And yeah, other than that, it doesn't need an awful lot of specialized care. Check for the thrips, as I was saying, but other than that, you should be good. Now let's go into some final thoughts and scoring on this one, shall we? So let's do scores first. Knowing what I know now, if I didn't own this plant, would I purchase this plant? Yes. 100%? Yeah, 100%. 100%. I've really enjoyed growing this plant a lot, more so than I thought I was going to, because again, I was kind of holding back going, this is supposed to be difficult. I don't know if it's going to be fun to grow, but actually, it's been been good. This has been good. I can't complain too much about it. Now, in terms of a score from 0 or 1 being the worst, 10 being the best, for this plant, I'd give this a 7, maybe an 8, maybe an 8. For people that have grown plants for a while, and it's the same caveat that I usually do, if you're starting off, maybe don't get this just yet. Get used to dealing with certain kind of slightly trickier plants so you can kind of react a lot faster to things, and then maybe get this. But for the average person who doesn't have that kind of in their back pocket, doesn't have that kind of a slight bit of experience, I would maybe give this more of a 5 or a 6. Like, it's a very stunning plant. It can be a bit pricey, but not as pricey as it used to be. My God, I'm like, whew, that was heavy on my arm. Not as pricey as it used to be. Is it beautiful? In my humble opinion, yes. I mean, look at the size of that leaf. And it grows columnar as well. So, but I think the reason why I'm taking off some of the score points is because it's still not the easiest of plants. As I said earlier on, I do agree with that. And we're at that point of the video now where I need to put the plant down because my arms are a bit sore. But yes, it is a bit tricky to kind of grow it. Again, this is in my experience. I've not had any root rot on that, but I think I'm just kind of very aware and more conscientious with, maybe that's not the right word, but hopefully that makes sense, as to the care that I give it more so than any other plant. I would never have that plant, I've just put it down, that's why you see me point there. I would never have that plant as a feral plant. I don't think it would ever really truly be a feral plant. In my experience, in my care with my conditions, with the fact that I'm growing it in semi-hydro. Had I have grown it in soil? Maybe. And I am moving a lot more plants in soil, so maybe I might move it into soil at some point. I will see. But overall, I've really enjoyed this. I've really, really enjoyed it. More so than I ever would have thought for a plant that essentially is very similar to my Philodendron esmeraldense. Let's do it this or that. If I had to choose between a Philodendron esmeraldense and a Philodendron Patriciae, for me, I would go, I would go with the esmeraldense every time. Yes, it's wider, but for the wow factor that this plant gives me without having ever experienced any real downside to it, and it can grow quite feral and it can grow in semi-hydro quite nicely, and it doesn't need a moss pole, it will still size up and it's consistent in its growth. Esmeraldense every time. But the Patriciae would be a quick second. So if I was to just compare it to the Heterocraspidum, which I'm still enjoying, smaller leaves, similar kind of vibes, that is much harder and much more temperamental, at least in my experience, than the Patriciae ever would be. Or again, based on what I've experienced with both of these plants. So yes, I would definitely have, again, decent score. Possibly not if you're just starting off. Maybe just wait a tiny bit and still get it. I'm not saying don't ever get it until you've got loads of plants, but get a few slightly more challenging plants under your belt first and then try this, and you should be good. And you might all turn around in the comments and say, you are talking rubbish, we have grown this and it's been super easy, but I always encourage you to share your thoughts down below, because my opinion is just my opinion and it's my experiences. Yours might vary, differ from mine, and other people's might do as well. So yeah, let us all know down below. You know the deal with these videos. Hopefully that becomes a bit of a repository for people to find kind of overall information on this plant. I don't think an awful lot of people have kind of talked too much about the Patriciae. The reality is I don't think there's going to be that many people that are going to be interested in watching this, other than all of my diehard subscribers, and I truly thank you. But yeah, hopefully you've all enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.